Hello everyone, this is Shintai, and I am being joined by my good friend Darren. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here discussing another fantastic game.
Why don't you, for the uninformed, give us a bit of an introduction as to who you are, and then segue into your history with Dark Souls and the Souls series and all that good stuff.
Certainly. So I'm Darren from TheGamingPilgrimage, which is a YouTube channel you just find here on YouTube, in which I basically review a lot of RPGs. I do retrospective videos covering series like Star Ocean, the Tales series, and sometimes I just cover other games, like including Dark Souls 3. So as for my history with the Souls series, I started back with Demon Souls on the PS3. I recall being all excited about the launch of that game after seeing a bunch of preview footage from the Tokyo Game Show. And all of my friends were just confused and baffled, going like, what are you talking about? This game looks like shit. And an interesting thing was they all compared it to like Oblivion or something like that. Just because the fantasy and medieval motifs, they're just comparing it to Oblivion, and they just thought like in comparison visually, the game did not hold up, and so it would be bad. And then as luck would have it, the game came out, was amazing. It won a lot of Game of the Year awards too. Then Dark Souls basically spiraled the series into popularity to a more mainstream audience. So I've been on board the series since day one, and since playing Demon Souls, I have played and beaten each of the Souls games multiple times, and that also extends to Bloodborne. I think I bought it day one. Is like one of the reasons I bought my PlayStation 4, and I've probably beaten the game about 4 times now.
Wow, that's awesome.
And then continuing from that, I've played and beaten Dark Souls 3 like 5 times now, including like an import copy before the game came out here in North America.
I think some people would say you have a problem.
Some people might call me fanatical. I would just say I'm hardcore.
That's a good way of looking at it. I similarly got into the series through Demon Soul, but surprisingly I didn't fall in love with it right away. I think it took me a bit of time because it was very different from other games and I wasn't really sure how to take it at first.
Is also a lot less refined than some of the later titles as well. I think that's a reason why Dark Souls really succeeded, because it was just like a much more refined and polished Demon Souls.
I agree with that. Originally, Dark Souls was supposed to be Demon Souls 2, but there were some licensing issues with Sony that kept that from happening. And when Dark Souls came out, I beat it and loved it. Actually, I beat it twice. It made me appreciate Demon Souls a lot more. I'd say that I respect Demon Souls more than I actively enjoy it, but I still think it's a good game. I also played Dark Souls 2, which I know a lot of people give that game shit, but I didn't think it was too bad, although when I first played it, I wasn't too happy with it.
Hey Shintai, how many dudes with armor did you fight? That's the one thing that made me really appreciate Demon Souls. When you go back and you look at all the boss fights in that game, you compare it to like Dark Souls 2, you can definitely see a lot more like experimentative and creativity behind the designs there.
Yeah, that's true. Dark Souls 2 is easily my least favorite in the series, and I think that's the case for a lot of people. But I'd still say that Dark Souls 2 is still a pretty good game. I enjoyed it.
They're all totally worth playing.
Yeah, definitely. I haven't sunken my teeth into Dark Souls 3 much. I made a first impressions video, and that's pretty much where I stopped playing, because I wanted to come back to Bloodborne and finish it.
Jumping back and forth between those two will just mess you up.
Yeah, because Bloodborne, I think Bloodborne is really good evidence for just how strong the core mechanics of this series is. Because Bloodborne, all it does is really, in the grand scheme of things, it just tweaks and alters a few things here and there, and makes it feel like a very different experience. And one of the most notable things that it does is remove blocking. Technically, there is a wooden shield you can pick up, but it's more of a joke than anything else. And the game really incentivizes the player to make use of the dodging as much as possible.
The game really pushes players to master the parry mechanic with the gun.
I actually completely ignored that in the game.
That is where a lot of the skill ceiling actually comes from for this game, because I found for my first playthrough I only relied on dodges, and it made a lot of fights, particularly Father Gascoigne, who is the second boss and often for many people is the last boss they face, because he's kind of like this checkpoint to see if you're good enough to go to the rest of the game in a way. That fight actually is almost invalidated if you master the parry mechanic, because it makes the fight completely one-sided. It's like the easiest way to clear through that game is to parry all the enemies.
This might be a controversial opinion, but I actually don't like the parry system in any of the games, and I kind of wish they were removed.
That is a very controversial opinion. The community is freaking out right now.
They are asking for blood right now. But the reason I say that is because I do think that it does take skill to master the parrying, but I feel like the reward is too great once you master it. Like, it invalidates the game so much to the point, like, if you do get good at it, the game is a little too easy, and I don't think that's good.
To an extent, because there's definitely a pro and con. There's definitely a big risk when you go to parry. It's never a 100% sure thing. I think Bloodborne handled the parry mechanic particularly a lot better than the other Souls games.
It's funny because I actually think it handles it worse because I feel that it's a lot easier to do parries in Bloodborne compared to the other games.
It can be. It depends on the gun you're using. For instance, I find the pistol weapons are a lot easier to get the parry with than with the shotgun. I find those are more effective just for interrupting enemies rather than actually parrying them. But I think the reason I prefer it than the Souls games is mainly just due to the PvP mechanic, where you fight players who just fish for parries. And I think it also comes to the weapon attack patterns in Bloodborne being so radically different and a lot faster, so you have to anticipate their attacks. Because I find with the Souls game, especially with some of the bigger weapons, you can see the attacks coming from like a mile away, so it's a lot easier to pull off that parry.
Another big problem with the Souls series was the backstab fishing.
Oh, that's a big thing.
Characters would just circle strafe, stab, stab, stab. And I think Bloodborne actually had a very elegant solution to that problem. You have to use a charge attack in order to do a backstab. I think there's probably multiple things that Bloodborne does better than any other Souls game. But I think one thing in particular that Bloodborne, hands down, has every other game in the series beat is the atmosphere. I love the Victorian era setting. It looks beautiful and gorgeous. I guess my only complaint on that end is we look at cities a little too much. But I think aside from that, the game in general looks gorgeous, the art style, the aesthetic, and just the thick, lachrymose atmosphere of the game is just beautiful.
Definitely. I think from an artistic standpoint alone, this is probably visually my favorite entry in the entire series. And once I heard the original pitch of Miyazaki saying that he wanted to make Bloodborne like the Tower of Latria in Demon Souls, he wanted to make that the whole game, I was immediately on board, because that's arguably like the most atmospheric level in that game. And a lot of players thought that was very memorable for good reason. And I'm glad they went as far as they did with the enemy designs and the boss designs in Bloodborne.
Bloodborne is very Lovecraftian inspired with its setting and the monster designs. It feels like a lot of the monsters have this Cthulhu-ish edge to them and how they look, like the amygdalas. I'm not overly familiar with Lovecraft, but even like a layman in that regard, I can still see all of the Lovecraftian inspirations in the game. And I really do think that it helps it because it just adds this unique look and feel to the game that you don't really see in a whole lot of other games.
I actually will admit that most people are now aware of the Lovecraftian influences in the game, because originally at launch, it was only really shown off to be involving like werewolves and maybe vampires. And once you play through the game and you start discovering this bizarre mystery behind Bergenworth, the Blood Church, and all these different organizations, a great example of this is in the cathedral. You see these statues that are kind of destroyed everywhere. And then once you actually enter the Grand Cathedral, you see these full-on statues of these like eldritch beings. And it really unravels this interesting mystery that I think, just due to how long the game's been out, that most people, even if you haven't played the game, are aware of.
Yeah, definitely. And it also ties in with the insight mechanic. The more that you progress in the game, and you find certain items that can increase as well, but just by progressing in the game, you gain more insight points. And this essentially makes it so that you're more aware of what's going on. Because a big thing with Lovecraft, the things that people would see in those stories were so horrible and so beyond their comprehension that they wouldn't be able to remember what they saw. So I think it's interesting that in this game they kind of tie that with an actual gameplay mechanic of sorts.
Although I will say insight's probably my least favorite mechanic in the entire game, especially when enemies can use insight against you, and that is incredibly infuriating in later areas of the game.
Right. One of the big drawbacks with the insight mechanic is that the more insight you have, the lower your frenzy resistance is, which is really annoying because there are certain enemies that are really difficult needlessly because of this.
Because essentially with the frenzy, it's a bar that keeps filling up until you take a sedative, and if you don't take a sedative, this bar will continuously fill, and once it does, I think you lose like 60% of your health. The Nightmare of Men's is such an annoying area because of the insight alone.
Now, I think it's fair to say, though, that the most important aspect of the Souls series in general is the combat, is the gameplay.
I would agree with that, but I will acknowledge that there will be a lot of people who disagree with that notion, and a lot of people play it only for the lore.
Well, here's the thing. I think what makes this franchise so good is that there are so many elements or so many components that work so well that you can be an individual that likes to focus on certain aspects of the game that you play. And more often than not, I feel that these games will satisfy that for you. If you are someone that just focuses on the story, these games will more likely than not fulfill that for you with the deep lore and seeing certain character arcs to their conclusion. Or if you're someone that is really focused on level design, if you're really focused on pure combat mechanics, there's just so many different aspects of these games, and Bloodborne is absolutely no exception, that just works so well. It doesn't matter who you are, you can get something out of it.
I think that's definitely part of the reason why Bloodborne was such a huge success for Sony and From Software. It's just that the material, especially for the setting, how it contributes to the lore, makes it a lot more appealing to a greater group of people. And as well, because you have those deep combat mechanics and interesting PvP systems, it appeals to a lot more players as well. And I think the culmination of all these elements definitely make for a more compelling package than, say, Demon Souls or Dark Souls 2.
I really feel, though, with Bloodborne, that if you haven't played any game in the series before, that I think Bloodborne could very well be a good choice.
I'd go as far as to say that if you aren't familiar with the Souls series, you'll probably have an easier time starting out in Bloodborne than someone who's really accustomed to how the gameplay works in the Souls series. Because it took me probably the first 10 hours of my first playthrough to actually understand how I need to react and attack in this game. Whereas I had friends who barely touched the other Souls games, and they were way ahead of me in the game because they just were able to understand the combat that much easier because they weren't relying on previous tricks or mechanics from old games.
Yeah, because in the older games, especially for me, I became very reliant on the shield. But with Bloodborne, it is purely based on evasive maneuvers and dodges. If you try to use that wooden shield, you're not going to get anywhere.
Have you actually ever tried to seriously use it in the game?
Once or twice.
You get wrecked. The instant you put that shield up, you're just signing your death release. You're just done.
It's pretty funny.
It's quite comical. I encourage everyone to try it at least once just to see the joke.
One of the things that really sets Bloodborne apart from the other Souls games are the trick weapons. I really like these. Basically like having two weapons in one. I do feel that some people have overblown their complaints about Bloodborne not having as many weapons as the Souls games, because I think the trade-off is that you have a lot more attacks and maneuvers at your fingertips all at once compared to the other games in the series. My personal favorite is the Holy Blade, because you can have either a short straight sword or you can combine it with the other half of the weapon, and you have this one giant great sword. So right then and there, your character is really versatile and you can handle different situations. If you're fighting some big, huge monster, you're going to want to get in as much stopping power as you have. But if you're fighting a bunch of smaller, faster enemies, then the normal sword is going to be more useful in that situation. And the other trick weapons have different applications for different situations as well, depending on what they are. And I just overall think that they're a great component that sets it apart from the Souls series. One of the things that makes Bloodborne special.
Definitely. I would agree that I prefer the trade-off of having a smaller weapon count for more unique and interesting movesets, but I will say that when Bloodborne first came out, I felt like they did a really poor job of distributing these weapons throughout the game, because for your first playthrough, especially if you don't have the DLC installed, you're only going to be using maybe 2 weapons for most of the game until you get to later areas and you have access to all the weapons. I really wish they opened up the store so that you could buy these weapons a lot easier, just so that you can have more variety. And something that really benefits the New Game Plus of this game is being able to have access to almost all the weapons and being able to experiment with what you like. Because some of my favorite weapons, like the Chikage, which is the blood katana, isn't available until you're in one of the final areas of the game. Well, it's even an optional area to get that weapon, which is Canehurst Castle. And my other favorite weapon is the Moonlight Greatsword from the Old Hunters DLC, which you can't get until you beat the first boss of that DLC, which is very difficult, and you need to be at endgame to be able to handle.
And I think the way that you get new weapons is also a little unclear because you can buy new weapons at the store in the Hunter's Dream, but the way to get more stuff at that store is to find badges, and the game doesn't really make this clear to you. You don't really know that this is what's adding new things to the store.
Did you have the Beast Claws?
I don't think I ever tried it.
It is one of the coolest weapons the entire game, and the only way to get it is to go through the less than amazing Chalice dungeons. And you have to go through a lot of Chalice dungeons to even get a chance of getting this weapon.
You know what? A lot of people really complained about the Chalice dungeons and how crappy they were. So when I went into the Chalice dungeons, I prepared myself. I'm like, okay, this is not going to be all that great. I honestly didn't find them all that bad. I can see why people aren't a fan of them. I don't think they're great or anything, but I don't think they're quite as bad as people make them out to be.
I think it was the promise of what they could be that got people really excited, because they're basically being pitched as like these really meticulously well-designed areas that you would be able to essentially just have infinite of. And then when you actually got the product, a lot of them are almost the exact same visually. And a lot of the room layouts are super boring and basic, and they're very straightforward, and you just got to find a lever and then you open the boss door and bam, you're done.
I definitely get that, and I did feel that the layouts were very samey and kind of boring. That being said, if you see them less as properly designed areas and you see them more as just an excuse to have more combat and have more enemies to fight, then I actually think they're pretty decent for that. One of the things about the Chalice dungeons is that there are enemies and bosses that are unique to the Chalice dungeons, and that, I would argue, that is at least one of the benefits of the Chalice dungeons. But if you just don't like going through them at all, then that's more of an annoyance than anything else.
I want to know how you feel about Fashionborn. Because in this game, unlike pretty much all the other Souls games, your actual clothing and equipment doesn't have a weight to it. And in previous games, depending on what your overall carrying capacity was, you would have slower rolls, slower movement, you'd expend more endurance for attacks. Whereas in Bloodborne, to keep it as fast as possible, there's no limit on any of your equipment. So as such, a lot of the armor doesn't necessarily have a lot of practical uses. So essentially, people refer to as Fashionborn is that you can wear pretty much whatever the hell you want. So I'm curious to see how you feel about this design philosophy of just express yourself through your clothing.
I prefer it. I can dig it. A lot of the stuff that I put on my character weren't stuff that was the most best defense or anything like that. I just put stuff on him that I'm like, oh, this looks cool, I'm gonna put this on.
I'd highly recommend the Knight set for a cool looking character.
Well, my character is like a weird fusion. He's wearing the crow feather garb, and he's wearing the old hunter's hat, and he's got the Canehurst gauntlets and the bone ash leggings.
So you're really going all out on the Fashionborn then.
I want him to look badass as fuck.
Because that's another thing in the Souls games. There's a point where you go, how stupid am I willing to look? But I really want these benefits. So that's like a big thing that's always come up for me in the Souls games is how cool do I want to look versus how effective is my gear. I do enjoy that about Bloodborne. Look as cool or as silly as you want.
Something I find a little strange about that, though, is that they still have stats. And it kind of makes me think, well, if you wanted people to focus more on just wearing whatever they want, what would even be the point?
I think they just did that so that it would be still somewhat strategic, because most of the stat differences aren't that major, so it's not really that much of an issue. I'd say the biggest thing is different elemental resistances are probably the only real key factor to consider in your clothing. For instance, some gear has way better frenzy resistance, so I would personally, in my playthroughs, I would equip that equipment near the end of the game where there's more frenzy-based enemies, just for that aspect. There's also some equipment that's, for instance, resists blood tinge, which you might wear if you're going into PvP, since a lot of people use blood tinge weapons, which, since there's not a lot of defense stats against that affinity.
Now, something else I think that this introduces, though, is that the other Souls games, to a certain extent at least, the way that the enemies and bosses were made, had to accommodate for multiple playstyles. That would include builds that couldn't dodge. I'm not saying that the bosses were nerfed and made easier or anything like that, but I did feel that with Bloodborne, by comparison, the design of the bosses and enemies was a little more razor sharp, just because there's no ambiguity here. All the players playing this game have the same dodge, so the enemies can be tailored around that fact.
I would straight up say that I think Bloodborne has the strongest boss designs and boss battles in the series. I think because they're able to focus on that type of play style, and since all players had to adhere to essentially the same mechanics, they were able to create way more compelling and interesting fights just purely by comparison. Especially if you go to something like Dark Souls 3, I felt like the boss department is probably where that game's the most lacking. Whereas in Bloodborne, I'd argue that's like the strongest point. A lot of the fights are really compelling and offer different challenges and make you, the player, adhere to these challenges. They challenge you in different ways, whereas other Souls games kind of just present to you a big guy who does a lot of damage and can take a lot of hits.
At the same time, though, I did feel that we were making fun of Dark Souls 2 with, oh, there's a bunch of guys in armor. But comparatively, I think Bloodborne suffers from big monster flailing about. Granted, they were a lot more interesting than anything in Dark Souls 2, and they all generally felt like unique monsters, but there was at least somewhat of a sameness of there was a lot of them that were big monsters that would flail about as they attack you.
I can understand that line of thinking, but I also think because there are so many crazy, weird monsters, I'd argue a lot of the monsters here have incredibly different attack patterns and they have different strategies for beating them. And I also think they really highlight the hunter to hunter boss fights or fighting characters who are equivalent to the type of character you are, and it makes those encounters feel a lot more special.
I didn't mean it as a huge complaint or anything.
No, yeah, I get that.
I was just pointing out that there is a little bit of a sameness to them in that respect.
There definitely is. I'm not arguing with you either, but that's just how I feel about it.
But at the same time, though, I think that makes some of the other boss fights, like Lady Maria, stand out a lot more.
That's probably one of my favorite fights in the whole game. To put this in terms I'm sure you'll appreciate, it makes it feel like that's your Virgil boss fight.
Yeah.
Where you have that character who is like you, but kind of cooler in a way. Heightens the tension in that battle. Especially when you see that they adhere to the same mechanics you do.
Again, I think it just makes all of the boss fights that aren't big giant monsters stand out a lot more and are a lot more memorable as a result. In that sense, even with the big dumb monsters, it kind of balances itself out in a way.
On the topic of boss fights, I want to get your opinion on the overall music in this game, because most boss fights this game actually have like a unique track. I would argue Bloodborne has the best soundtrack in the entire Souls series, but I'm curious to see what your take is on that.
I don't know. I still feel really strongly about the Dark Souls soundtrack.
I can agree with that. That is arguably the one to beat.
Bloodborne's soundtrack was great and extremely fitting, but there's just tracks in Dark Souls that stick out in my mind more, like Great Wolf Sif's.
I think the one thing that gives the edge to Bloodborne, it's all orchestral, whereas a lot of the Souls games just use like synthesized instruments and it's more digital, whereas this is all them recording an orchestra, and I feel like that adds a more visceral impact to the music, especially for the final boss fight in particular. That's like arguably like my favorite track in the whole series.
Something I do like a lot about Bloodborne's soundtrack is how operatic it is. There's like choirs in the background, really hammering in just how disturbed the game is.
And it's all attached to the boss stages. Like the stages in the fight, the tempo will change and the choir will kick in when they enter their super rage mode and all that, and it really heightens the battle.
The choir elevates it and makes it feel like what you're fighting really is just monstrosity.
So on the topic of fights, I know you're not huge on this aspect and you probably did not have access to it at all. You might have been able to get a sense of it through if you fought any NPCs, but how do you feel about the PvP? Because I know you said you don't have PlayStation Plus, so...
Nah, I didn't access it. The only thing I can really comment on that end is some of the hunters that you fight in the game. I think that'd be the closest comparison.
Those are pretty accurate to what you would face online.
So talking about them specifically, I was a bit mixed on them because there were some that were fun to fight and I thought were really cool, and others just felt really cheap and weird.
I think the one problem that exists with the NPC hunters is that they just have way too much HP.
One in particular that gave me a hard time was this one hunter in the old Hunters DLC who was in a cave and he had a Gatling gun. The reason he pissed me off so much, he had infinite ammo.
Was he wearing a bandana?
I'll give you that. That was pretty good.
So if he's wearing a bandana, it's legit. If he isn't, that's hacks.
That fight in particular really irked me because I feel like these characters in particular should work on the same rules that the player is, and he's clearly not. He has infinite ammo. Get out of here with that.
And he has the same dodge as you and a similar mobility level, but he gets infinite bullets because screw you.
It always pissed me off whenever they would heal themselves too. It's just like, oh, you're just making it worse.
Yep. Although I don't think they have access to 20 blood vials like you do. At least I don't think so. I never encountered an NPC who healed himself 20 times. But I'll definitely say in the actual PvP, the whole blood vial system is something of an issue because you have access to so much healing. And some people will argue that players will adhere to what in the Souls community is referred to as PvP etiquette, where you're not supposed to heal during your duels. But I find, especially if you're invading someone, a lot of people do not adhere to these rules at all. So it creates these really drawn out encounters. But at the same time, because the movement is so fast and fluid and you have such interesting weapon combos, the PvP can be really interesting and intense if you decide to delve into that.
Honestly, and I think that's kind of a hot topic with Bloodborne in general, is the blood vials. And I feel that they are a marked downgrade from the Estus flasks, which I thought were awesome.
Yeah, it's a weird area because for a game like Bloodborne, I understand why they would want to have an increased amount of healing that you can do. But at the same time, I really don't like how you can get to points where you need to grind enemies in order to buy blood vials or just find them in the environment. Especially at the beginning of the game where you're just learning how to play, and chances are you might be getting your ass kicked and you really need to grind for them.
I already said I haven't played too much of Dark Souls 3, but I think I can safely say that Dark Souls 3 handles it the best, because I did feel that in the first Dark Souls, the Estus can get a little overpowered. You could do something in the bonfire to make it so that you can have 20 Estus, but I think Dark Souls 3 handles it the best, because in order to be able to hold more Estus flasks, you have to find the Estus shards, and then you can hold one more Estus flask, and I thought that was perfect.
To play devil's advocate, though, because you always have access to at least 20, you do have the ability for you can use a blood vial to get more silver bullets for your weapon, which I think is a very good mechanic, and it's something that I welcome, because as well as blood vials, you need to keep up with your inventory for silver bullets that you can shoot your gun. I feel like some of the levels in Bloodborne were a bit more difficult and a bit larger, and because you had more healing, it wasn't really a problem to go through. It never felt like a slog, because you always had access to so much healing. Because in something like Dark Souls, you need those frequent checkpoints. Otherwise, if you have a level that takes an hour to get through and you only have 6 Estus flasks, it's going to pose a problem.
So you think with Bloodborne, they felt more confident in having more spaced out checkpoints?
Mm-hmm. I think the best way to handle this is that they should just give you 20. They shouldn't make you grind for it as a separate inventory item.
The grinding did get really annoying. Although I think when you compare the blood vials and the Estus flasks, I don't think this is a problem with a simple solution, because both have their pros and their cons. Like you just said with the blood vials, it does excuse having elongated level design, and they can make the levels a little bit bigger. But then you have the grinding as an issue. Your mileage may vary.
It also depends how good you are, because you could get to a point where if you're good enough with the parry and you have the right accessories and blood gems equipped, you can recover a lot of your HP by doing riposte after you do a counter.
In general, though, I think I just prefer Estus.
I won't disagree with that at all. I'm probably on the side of that. Also, can we talk about how triangle is to heal in this game?
Yeah, that tripped me up for a while.
In the Souls games, but by using your square, use whatever item you have, and oftentimes you'll just have your Estus equipped. So a lot of people associate that button with healing. And in Bloodborne's no, it's triangle now. Deal with it. And it just messes you up. And that's why when Shintai at the very beginning was saying that he was going back from Dark Souls 3 and Bloodborne, I was saying that's going to kill you, because chances are you're going to mess up your healing button and get killed because of it.
You know what? Even because of that, what would end up happening is I would still think I have a shield, and then I'd end up switching to the different trick weapon. I'm like, no, stop!
I would not recommend going back and forth between Dark Souls 3 and this game, just because the switching controls alone will just get you killed so hard. In both games, likely.
I'd say in general, it's probably best to space out your time between these games.
Although I will say, the one thing I really appreciate about Bloodborne is I feel like this is a game that once you master it, running through it becomes more and more fun, especially through the new Game Plus system, and having the 3 multiple endings gives you more incentive to play through the game.
Going back to the gameplay, I want to ask, what was the weapon that you mained?
My original playthrough, I used the Hunter's Axe for most of it, and then I'd switch back between that and Ludwig's Holy Blade because that is a great weapon. That is a fantastic weapon. But on future playthroughs, when I've messed around with different builds, I really like the Chikage because of the Blood Tinge skill. And its second mode will use the Blood Tinge as a damage scaler, and it's super effective and really fun to use. And I'm actually a big fan of a lot of the DLC weapons that you get access to in the Old Hunters DLC. I think it's 10 new weapons overall, and I really like the Pizza Cutter. I don't actually recall its real name, but everyone just kind of started calling it the Pizza Cutter, which is like this giant circular saw, and that's a lot of fun to use. But I really, really enjoy Bloodborne's version of the Moonlight Greatsword, which is in every From Software game, and this is probably my favorite version of it.
Mainly, when I first started playing the game, I used the threaded cane at first. I thought that was a pretty good weapon. Then I used the Kirk hammer for a while, and I thought that was an improvement, but at the same time, I also felt like the hammer was a little bit unwieldy. And then I started using the Holy Blade and never went back.
Did you try out with any of the DLC weapons?
I wanted to use the Moonlight Greatsword, but I needed like 14 Arcana to use it. I didn't have that.
Oh, it's so worth using. It's such a good weapon. The Moonlight Greatsword being the secondary mode for it is so cool, and it works super well. Or alternatively, if you go a Dex build, Simon's Bowblade is super good. So actually, while we're talking about the DLC, how have you felt about the DLC overall, and maybe in comparison to other Dark Souls DLC?
I've beaten Dark Souls' DLC, Altorius of the Abyss, and I've beaten all the DLC from Dark Souls 2. Weirdly enough, I'd actually say that Dark Souls 2 has the best DLC. And I don't know if it's because it has 3 huge pieces of DLC, while Bloodborne and Dark Souls only have 1 piece of DLC to really compare it to. But I just felt like there was a lot of content in the Dark Souls 2 DLC. It was really fun.
I think I know the reason behind this. It's because the Dark Souls 2 DLC is better than the base game.
That is unquestionably true.
So I'd probably say Artorias the Abyss is my favorite DLC, just from all the lore implications, the new areas and weapons and bosses you had access to. But I do really like the Old Hunters, and my main thing for liking it is just because of all the new weapons you get access to.
Here's my problem with Artorias of the Abyss. It feels less like DLC and more, this was going to be in the game, and it got cut.
I'm okay with it because you got such good content out of it, and because Dark Souls 1 at a surface level has a lot of content as is.
It is great. I'm not begrudging it really for this. It just didn't really feel like it was DLC to me. Comparatively with Bloodborne, the Old Hunter did feel like DLC. It didn't just feel like, oh, this was originally going to be in the game and we cut it out. It really did feel like they went back and they created this whole new thing for the game. And overall, I think it's really good. I really enjoy it. One of the things I really appreciate about it is because it's a weird dreamscape, they got really crazy with some of the design of the areas. After you beat Lady Maria, you walk through this weird clock tower looking thing, and then you just end up outside in the Fisherman's Hamlet. And they got really crazy with the design, and it was able to be excused because, oh, it's a dream or whatever. So I thought that was really cool. And I'd say all the DLC for these games is worth it. Normally, I don't really even like buying DLC. The Souls games are pretty much the only ones where I've actually gone out of my way to get the DLC, and I've been pretty satisfied with them. Especially with the fact that Bloodborne adds all of these new weapons. I think that's really awesome because the base game already had a bunch of awesome weapons. They didn't just half-ass it. They made a lot of really cool weapons for the DLC that can expand your playstyle even more. The only real problem I have with the Old Hunters DLC, it's fucking hard as shit.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, I feel like the Old Hunters is probably the most difficult piece of Soulsborne content ever released.
And I think that kind of puts up a barrier for getting that extra cool stuff, which is a shame.
Hey man, you want to get the cool stuff, you got to get good.
Yeah, you gotta get good.
So I know we've kind of danced around this topic, but it's a big part of the series and franchise as a whole. How do you feel about the overall lore of Bloodborne?
I had no idea what the fuck was going on.
I had this going way back on when Dark Souls 1 launched, where my friends and I would have like conversations about what we thought the lore would be, because that was at the point where it wasn't all online yet, and there wasn't hundreds of thousands of people discussing what the lore could be, and it was before all the big Souls YouTubers came out with their lore videos that were trying to piece together what was going on. And Bloodborne definitely had that going on, especially when I first beat the game. I just sat there and just with my hands in the air going, what? What happened? What does this mean?
What really kind of weirded me out was there was like an implication. One of the boss said like, oh, even in a dream, a hunter's a hunter. I'm like, wait, what? We're in a dream now? I thought the old Hunters DLC was a dream. Is the main game a dream too?
And if you ask anyone about a narrative, they'll always tell you revealing that it's all a dream is like the worst thing you can do. And Bloodborne might be the only like narrative to get away with it because it's so complex and bizarre.
It doesn't really seem like it's a dream in a traditional sense. It seems like it's a dream in like a metaphysical sense or something. I was able to get a lot out of the lore in the first Dark Souls, and I actually took the time to try and learn what was going on for the most part, and I got a lot out of that. I didn't feel as compelled with Bloodborne though, and I think a big part of that is because one of the things I really liked about the lore in Dark Souls was how compelling the characters were. A lot of the characters represented human emotions in the most raw form possible. Like Sigmire, for example, really represents human failure and not being able to reach the heights all of us as individuals want to reach and dealing with our inferiority. The main character of the game does a lot of things for Sigmire, and the more that sinks in for him, the more he starts to hollow out. None of that's in Bloodborne. There aren't any characters that go through these great arcs that are symbolic of the human condition or anything like that. So I found it a lot harder to care about the lore. I think the lore is cool based on what I could gather for the setting, but not so much the characters.
I feel like the lore in Bloodborne is the most obscured it's ever been. It's something that you have to really go out of your way, and then once you find it, it's really difficult to interpret, especially because you have to wrap your mind about how this whole dream and nightmare phenomena works and how it works with the Great Ones and all this other stuff. But it is a really interesting rabbit hole to explore if you're really invested in it, especially because of the setting. It does invite some really interesting mysteries that can actually be answered if you look for it.
I would say it like this. If you're the kind of person that really gets into characters, then Dark Souls is more your speed. But if you're someone that purely loves world building, you really love getting into the nitty-gritty of how they work, how they're created, Bloodborne is more your style.
I could agree with that.
So, to bring this all together, Bloodborne is an amazing game. I think that if you've been, turned off by the other Souls games, I would say this might be the one that convinces you because it's just different enough. I can understand that some of the other Souls games might not appeal to certain people. The medieval look to them might not do it for certain people, but I think just the fact that Bloodborne has its Victorian era setting, it's so unique and different in that alone, I think that will really get people interested. But even just beside that, this is just a really well-crafted game. Yeah, it's a hard game, and I feel that if you go into it and you try to play it casually, you're going to get your ass handed to you. It's a game that really expects a lot out of the player, but I think if you just take your time and you don't rush through it, you're going to get a lot out of this game. You're going to find combat that's really deep and fun. You're going to get this great sense of atmosphere, beautiful music, awesome boss fights. I feel confident saying that when you play this game, when you're done with it, you're going to be able to say, like, I haven't played something like that before. Even if you have played the other Souls games, it still feels like its own thing. Bloodborne, awesome game. What are your final thoughts?
I agree with everything you just said. I couldn't have said it better myself. And I definitely agree with the sentiment that if you're someone who's tried to get into the series before and you were unable to for whatever reason, Bloodborne, it seems for a lot of people, especially my friends who honestly are not very big on the Souls games, really enjoyed what Bloodborne had to offer just due to how much faster paced it was, how it had new setting and new interesting locale and more mysteries to discover that were quite different from those present in Dark Souls. And so I definitely think there's something here for any type of player, provided of your skill level, because I think Bloodborne, more so than the other games, does a much better job of teaching you the mechanics through raw gameplay, and it kind of reinforces this idea of not only does your character improve and level up, but you as the player improve and level up along the journey, and it creates a really satisfying and somewhat unique experience that isn't really too common in this day and age. And so if you have a PS4, there's absolutely no reason you should not, at the very least, try this game out.
I also want to add this one little bit. Bloodborne makes you feel badass. Even when you lose, you still feel pretty badass in this game. Unlike the Souls games that make you feel kind of small, even if you've got cool armor, you rarely feel badass in the Souls games. Bloodborne, with your fucking cool-ass trench coat flowing in the wind as you're sticking your fists inside of werewolves and ripping out their guts and stuff, it makes you feel really badass. And I think that's another really defining aspect of Bloodborne. And I think that's another thing that I think people can really get into. They're gonna feel like a badass demon hunter skulking through the night. Alright, thank you very much for joining me, Darren. Always a pleasure to have you.
Always great to discuss great games with you. Good to reflect on great games that are worth mentioning and are worth playing, especially to you, the listener.
That's pretty much it. Please be sure to check out Darren's channel. Link will be in the description. Great guy, I would have to say. That's why I brought him on.
Well, thank you, sir.
Alright, this has been Shintai and Darren from The Gaming Pilgrimage. Take care, everyone.